Primitive finch flowers are finch? You mean finch, like a bird? Flowers that birds like? No, finch. Wait, that's not even a word. Sure, it's a word. I can spell it. Watch. F-E-N-S-H. Well, just because you spell it doesn't make it a word. Oh, wait, it's an acronym, isn't it? Yes. And what this is an acronym, it's an acronym that describes what can be regarded as being primitive flowers or ancestral kinds of flowers. Flowers that are like the first flowers. Think about what flowers are. Think about what plants are. Plants have a pretty simple morphology, anatomy, development. Most of the parts on plants are modified leaves. And some of the flower parts really look like leaves, like sepals, especially in petals, and well, we learned that carpels are modified seed leaves. Stamens too, modified leaves. And if we think about the way that leaves are arranged on, say, a branch of a tree, they're typically about the same size and shape. And even though they're alternately arranged, they're actually in spirals around the branch. And there's lots of them. And those features that have flower parts that are kind of the way that leaves are arranged on a branch are believed to be what are the primitive or ancestral types of flowers. And what FENSH stands for are words that can be used to describe the parts of flowers that are rudimentary in this way. Free, equal, numerous, spiral, hypogynous. Let's look at what we mean by that. Free stands for or signifies that the parts of the flowers are free from each other. They're separate. In other words, like sepals and petals, we've seen situations where the petals are fused. Well, originally they weren't. And flowers that have the flower parts that are separate are regarded as being comparatively primitive, sort of an ancestral trait. Equal signifies equal, not equal in number, but equal in size and shape. In other words, radially symmetric. Numerous means that the flower parts, not the flowers themselves, but the parts of the flowers, such as the sepals and sometimes the petals, often the stamens and often the carpels, are numerous, more than, say, 3 or 4 or 5. And when things are numerous, they are and situated in a small space on an elongate receptacle, they are kind of by geometric definition arranged in a spiral fashion. And since development takes place, producing sepals and petals and then stamens and then carpels, a simple ancestral primitive kind of flower will have the order of arrangement be such that they are hypogynous with a superior ovary. So that's what FENSH stands for. These are the traits of somewhat primitive flowers. Here's an example of a so-called FENSH flower, a flower that might be what some of the first flowers were like. You can see numerous petals and numerous stamens, and if you look really carefully, you can see numerous carpels in there. This is a water lily. Here's a more familiar example. It's a buttercup, and even though it doesn't have numerous sepals, I think it has 5 down there, and you can see there's only 5 petals. The stamens, if you're doing your floral analysis worksheet on this, you'd probably say something like too numerous to count. It's sort of it's a high indeterminate number of stamens, and they're spirally arranged. Ditto for the carpels. There's not a discrete little number like 3 or 4 or 5, but there's bunches of them, and they're spirally arranged. And that is the spiral and the numerous part. And also, it's hypogynous. You can see these pistils are way above the petals and the stamens. Here's this buttercup in fruit. These are carpels that matured into achenes. This is several fruits from one flower. So those are the features that characterize sort of the ancestral condition of flowers. And as we already have learned by doing our floral analysis worksheet, we've seen some flowers that have some fusion of parts. We've seen flowers with comparatively small numbers of parts, like 4 petals or 5 petals. We've seen sympetals, corollas. I just mentioned that, but I wanted to be explicit about what parts are fused. We've seen flowers that were epigynous, perhaps. So And especially interestingly, we've seen some instances of flowers that are bilaterally symmetric, that are zygomorphic to uh, coerce pollinators to manipulate themselves in the way that's advantageous to the flowers. So those are the things that we're going to look at when we look at variation among plant families. Now, here's a distinction that's useful and uh, a little bit deserving of explanation at the same time. And this is the distinction between monocotyledons and dicotyledons. And in addition to the fact that they have different numbers of seed leaves, cotyledons, which you practically would never observe, what we have are a very nice way to begin to classify and make distinctions among plants. And when we use our manuals, including the Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, or if we were in the actual lab, we would use a wonderful manual called Gleason and Cronquist. These books were written in the 1980s and 1990s, and they didn't incorporate some of the recent changes in understanding and sort of a more emphasis upon the phylogenetic, the relationships among plant groups as we do today. So there's a little bit of sort of traditional, kind of archaic use of terms that we're going to adhere to, because it'll help us still get a grasp on the flora, and also because the books we use will use monocotyledons and dicotyledons as though they're co-equal separate branches of angiosperms. It's not exactly true, but we can still tell them apart. So dicots have their flower parts, count the parts, the petals and the sepals, in 4s and 5s, typically. Not always, but typically. And the leaves are often not linear and grass-like. They can be broad, and they will have a net venation. Another thing about dicots is that many of them are what are called herbs, bendy, flexible plants that aren't woody. Almost all of our plants that are woody, like maples and oaks and tulip trees, not tulips, are dicots. By contrast, monocots, they have their flower parts in 3s, not their flowers, but typically 3 sepals, 3 petals, stamens 6, which is 2 times 3, typically 3 carpels. And they also tend to have linear leaves, grass-like leaves, or narrow like lily-like leaves, or cattail-like leaves, or iris-like leaves, sort of blade-shaped with linear veins. And in our area, although there are a lot of dicots that are herbs, monocots are almost all not woody. Our only exceptions are an annoying vine called smilax, greenbrier, catbrier, which is has a lot of prickles and it's aggravating to walk through it. But it's a woody vine, and also bamboo are examples of woody monocots. But all of the monocots we have are herbaceous. So those are the 2 very convenient categories. Here's a more realistic view of plant evolution, and what it does is recognizes that there's basically a tree-like branching pattern of lineages, and that rather than being 2 simple groups, there's different groups that are diverged from the basal group at different times. So down here at the base are what are called basal angiosperms, and there's a branch that diverged from the basal angiosperms that are indeed monocots. So monocots, because it includes an ancestor and all of the descendants, because it's a branch in and of itself, that's regarded as being a true, authentic group. It's clade, what's called a clade. It's a branch on the evolutionary tree. And you can refer to monocots, and that's a legitimate thing to do. Dicots, on the other hand, could be thought of as being everything that isn't a monocot, but unfortunately it doesn't include any ancestor in all of the descendants, because down here with these basal angiosperms, some of these are ancestors of the monocots as well as the rest of the plants. So what's often done to retain the convenience of recognizing these categories is to refer to monocots and what are called eudicots. EU means true. So we still have a distinction between monocots and dicots, but with little asterisks saying, dicots, we're kind of fudging it and referring to eudicots. And there's a few plants at the base, the basal to all of them, that we're kind of fudging with about. So again, for convenience, this categorization is very useful for keying things out and for recognizing patterns of diversity and understanding Ohio's plants. So, as we begin to look at the plant families of Ohio, the important ones, let's get a little background on how we can get a feeling for what families are important, and also mention some resources that are available to us working with the flora. So what I have before you here is a picture of a document that is actually a tool. And what it is it's a tool called the Floristic Quality Assessment Index. And this is basically a mechanism to evaluate the quality of vegetation in an area. So each plant in Ohio has been given basically a score, like how cool it is, and on a scale from 0 to 10, with 10 being plants that are found only in very restricted, narrowly defined, high-quality natural areas that are the kind that would have been around in pre-settlement times, and lower-numbered ones with a lower floristic quality index, or what's called, I should say clearly, a coefficient of conservatism is the score for the individual plants. The low CC plants are kind of things, weedy plants that might be seen in a variety of places. So this document / tool was developed by 3 prominent biologists, Barbara Andreas, John Mack, and Jim McCormick, all of whom are friends of mine. Well, Facebook friends anyway. One of them was an actual friend, and Barbara Andreas. And what they did was, in addition to, with their deep understanding of Ohio's flora, determining which ones had which coefficients of conservatism assigned to them, they also produced this great document that's basically a published document and also a spreadsheet, which you can see on your right, that has all the species in Ohio and info about them, what family they belong to, and some features about their growth form, that sort of thing. And so I worked with the spreadsheet a little bit and determined the number of species in each of these families. Now, this is an earlier version of the document, so these numbers aren't current. I should update them, but using this document, a little over 2,000 flowering plants and about 150 families. About 10 of them comprise about half of the plants in Ohio. So in descending order, here are the plant families of Ohio, and we're going to learn 8. Not necessarily the top 8. We're going to make some slight differences. We're going to learn the all-important Asteraceae. The Cyperaceae and the Poaceae, these are graminoids, grasses and sedges. They're really important. They're really technical. They're not super technical, but they're a little bit more advanced and not something we're going to direct our attention to in our understanding of plant families. The rose family and the legume family and the mustard family and the mint family. Now, the Scrofulariaceae is a family that, for one thing, is now subdivided into a number of smaller families, and a lot of their features we can learn also in some similar families, particularly the mint family, Lamiaceae. So, sorry, Scrofs. The lily family is another family that's been broken up into smaller families, but we're going to sort of ignore that because the features that tie them together, these are showy monocots, and we really want to learn some showy monocots, so we'll include them. And because we also want to learn about buttercups because they have nice FENSH flowers, and the parsley family because they're just so cool, we're going to sadly neglect a few other families. So I think this is 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, those are 8 plant families. Here's some pictures that show what they sort of look like. These are some pie charts with pieces of pie that represent their proportion of the flowering plant kingdom pie. The sunflower family is asters, daisies, goldenrods, where what look like individual flowers are actually a cluster of flowers. Sedge family, they look like grasses, but they're they have closed leaf sheaths and um, spirally arranged flowers and little spikelet things. Grasses, really cool. They have sort of flattened groups of flowers and open leaf sheaths. Really neat, but not something we can direct our attention to right away. The rose family kind of has FENSH flowers, few departures and a lot of diversity, but look at all those stamens in that rose family, Jabiru. The fabulous Fabaceae with some nice bilateral symmetry, and that beautiful unicarpellate gynoecium. The Brassicaceae with the four sepals and the four petals. The mustard family, nice one. The Lamiaceae, the mint family. Look at these fused petals and look at this zygomorphic symmetry. What a nice family. The Scrophulariaceae, which we're kind of stepping past. Now the Liliaceae, showy monocots. What are called tepals sometimes. Petals and sepals that look really, really alike. Flower parts in threes. Things like lilies and trout lilies and trilliums. Onions, asparagus, great family. Well, not anymore. It's been broken up into a lot of separate families, but for convenience, again, our Newcomb's Flower Guide and some of the manuals that we use to identify plants, they have the older classification system, and for convenience, we can work with the old Liliaceae, just knowing that if you want to be really accurate, you should look it up and see what family your species is in now. And that's what we're going to do in order to learn learn those 8 plant families. One thing I kind of really like, I like iconography, and there's a field guide which we don't happen to be using. It's another nice one. It's by Peterson, who kind of developed field guides in a big way in North America in the middle of the 20th century, and he's an artist. And he had a field guide to flowers that mentioned plant families. And what he did, in addition to having little descriptions of the families, he has these beautiful icons, these little pictures that show kind of the characteristics of the family in a little sort of emoji kind of thing. And I'm really enamored with these little emoji type things, these little icons. So when we look at our plant families, there'll be a little symbol that once you learn what the plant family is like, and you look at the symbol, you'll see why Roger Tory Peterson drew the symbol that way. So I hope you enjoy seeing these little icons in our upcoming descriptions of the 8 plant families.